Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast. This week we are again joined by Fleur mikitacurve. Hello.
Hello.
And he's here today to talk specifically about the Moscow Metro. So, just as a really quick primer, why are we talking about the Moscow Metro today?
Good question, right? Why the heck am I on the podcast? I think the Moscow Metro is really interesting because it tells us a lot about not just urban planning and architecture and all those things, but about Soviet art and culture more generally, especially in the 1920s and 30s, when I know the most about it. It's sort of a lens to understand how Soviet society went from what it was in the 1920s and the period of the NEP through its more radical periods in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and then how it sort of transformed into the state juggernaut that we are sort of think of as totalitarianism manifest in the Great Terror in the 1930s. And the Moscow Metro is a really interesting example of all these processes as they sort of, at their most interesting, as they're really happening. Why the Moscow Metro? Why public transit? The other aspect of that is that we think we have an idea of public transit these days. We think we know that public transit means socialism and socialism means public transit. But the Moscow Metro is sort of at the beginning of that association. And it's really interesting to me to see how that association emerged and where it came from, because it wasn't always the case. I don't know if you were about to ask me this question, but I might preempt you a little bit here. Nowadays, like I said, we think that that's socialism. Public transit and socialism are the same thing. But at the time, there was really almost an association between rightist tendencies in the Soviet Union and public transit. And so if we want to go into more depth about this, I can do it in a second. But
One thing you mentioned just now is the idea that the Metro as an idea was sort of rightist, which, yeah, it does sound odd, but I assume there is a reason for that.
Oh, definitely, yeah. So in the 1920s, we're looking at the world's first socialist state in the form of the Soviet Union. There never had been a socialist, successful socialist state before. And it was the testing ground for a lot of assumptions that people had made about what socialism would look like. So at the time, there was no model of what a city should look like in socialism. There was no model of what public transit should look like in socialism. And so a lot of people looked at the Metro and thought, oh, well, that's a relic of the capitalist past. It's a way for capitalists to expand the range of land around their factories that workers can live on and still commute to work in time. And it's alienating. It's dark. It smells bad. It's disgusting. Why would anybody want to bring this forward into the world of the utopia of socialism that we're going to build? And of course, a lot of those objections are context dependent, but it was seen as a device of capitalist alienation, is the point.
And yet they built it. So what?
Yes.
Yeah. So what led to them building it despite these objections? And I guess the question is it that it was built in spite of the objections, or that the objections changed, that they stop objecting to it at all?
Exactly, yeah. So at first, it was sort of going on despite these objections in the mid-1920s. But then there's that period of radicalism that I mentioned earlier, which is often referred to as the Cultural Revolution from around 1928 to 1931 in the Soviet Union. And that really changes the debate. That is the moment where the Metro goes actually entirely off the table for a while. And a ton of really interesting radical ideas are basically have a lot of sway. But then around 1931-32, Stalin starts to codify a particular line in art and architecture and starts to shut down on some of the more radical ideas that were being propagated. And that's when a metro comes back into the realm of possibility, and in a big way where it's no longer associated necessarily with rightism, because Stalin sort of had I can get into this later, but there's an extent to which, as he shuts people out of the debate, he then starts to adopt their policy positions, not because he necessarily just wanted to get them out of the way and then steal their thing for popularity, but because he legitimately wanted to do something and just didn't want to be associated with his political opponents. Anyway, long story short, in the early 1930s, it becomes it's looked on much more positively. The idea of building a metro, it becomes an example of what the new socialist society should look like as that socialist society starts to coalesce, and it's no longer a matter of theorizing. It becomes much more concrete and much more defined by the ideals of the artistic movement of socialist realism. And that is when the objections sort of are overruled, and it becomes a showpiece for what Stalin's vision of a socialist society is.
And in parallel with that, though, were there practical reasons also that the metro went from not just it's ideologically acceptable, but also to some extent a practical necessity?
Oh, definitely, yeah. So the other thing is that if you're just looking at Moscow in material terms in the 1920s and 30s, there are some crises going on, to put it lightly. And of course, what counts as a crisis is kind of socially constructed. That's I think the article where I got this idea, I'm sure it shows up much earlier, but there's this article about the Cuban Missile Crisis by Jutta Veldez, where she talks about how crises are sort of cultural artifacts that reflect what a society is concerned with. So these crises, the transit crisis is going on in the 1920s. There's a ton of congestion. People are walking several hours to get to work. Depending on your perspective, it could be a catastrophic situation. There's also a housing crisis. The population of Moscow collapses in the Civil War and then rebounds dramatically in the new economic policy, that period of liberalized economics in the early 1920s. So that by 1926, if I remember the figures correctly, the population is back to 2 million. 1928, it's 2.3. 1930, it starts to balloon crazily. It's like nearly 3 million. And what I do remember very clearly is that in 1933, at the sort of height of metro construction, as it's really swinging into gear, I guess the real height is 1934, whatever. At that point, the population of Moscow is now 3.6 million. And housing stock has been added over the 1920s and 1930s, but nowhere near fast enough. So you have situations of people, especially migrant laborers, living, several people in a single room with a single bed, sleeping on benches and tables, entire families crammed into just a couple of square meters in what used to be bourgeois apartments that have been subdivided. And so that, combined with a ton of congestion because of the street design of Moscow is very radial. So near the center, there are all these crisscrossing tiny streets that are often looked at, and people think of it and say, oh, it's a medieval city still. And to be fair, there had been very little conscious urban planning until the 1920s, 1930s in Moscow. But the point is that these are both crises of unusability and lack of access to materials. And they were constructed as crises because they served state sort of interests in an ideological battle that was going on at the time. They served the state's desire to say that it was doing something to solve these problems, but also not just that it was doing something, that it was doing a particular thing that that contrasted with other ideas, again, with other ideas of how to build a socialist society.
So what we seem to be coming to is the idea that by the late 1920s, there's this sort of convergence of things that on the one hand, you have sort of the rise of Stalin and quote-unquote Stalinism, and essentially changes to the way that socialism is conceptualized on the one hand, and also just the practical necessities of the city on the other. Is it just, a combination of Stalin and practical reality? How are other people in Soviet state and society now viewing matters? If we can go into a couple of just concrete examples of individual figures, if they exist.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's a great thing to prompt me on. That I wasn't sure how much depth to go into on it, but basically, I think the key to understanding the political situation at the time is that there are sort of three blocks. There's the left, the right, and the center. And those are massive, big tents. There are people who would never want to be in the same room with each other that I'm grouping together here into one of those just for convenience. But basically, there's the right tendency, again, the people who favor sort of a more liberal economic policy, who are willing to work with the peasantry because they're afraid of the consequences of trying to force them into the desired socialist economic, conditions that the leftists want to see in place. There are the leftists who are very much radical and want to see a socialist society built right this second. What's stopping us? We can do it. They're often very pro-industry, in the case of Trotsky, for example. So Trotsky is another big name. I should say Bukharin is kind of the leader of considered the leader of the rightist tendency, the lenient towards the peasantry tendency. Trotsky is sort of considered the leader of the leftist tendency, but there are also some people who aren't as hot on industry. Maybe they still want to see an industrialized Soviet Union, but they want to see a very decentralized Soviet Union. They don't want to see industry, again, the way it had been done in capitalist societies. They want to see decentralized sort of federation of small towns, basically, that happen to have all this heavy industry and industrial capacity so that the Soviet Union can produce what it needs for its people. But it's not necessarily, they don't want to go through that sort of your mental image of British capitalism in the 1840s stage of the Industrial Revolution. And that, I think, is actually a good segue to talk about a couple of particular schools of thought within that sort of leftist big tent, which is to say radical kinds of urbanism in particular. So I will say radical urbanism, I'll say anti-urbanism. There are two specific schools led by two guys named Savsovich and Akhitevich, who you don't need to remember which is which, but basically one is called the urbanists counterintuitively, and they want that sort of federation of small towns. They are thinking of the Communist Manifesto and this idea of decentralization and sort of verdant utopia, but based around small town councils. And so they don't want to see cities at all. They want everything to be based around decentralized, still small urban, agglomeration, but nowhere near like Moscow. And then there's also the other school that is kind of important within what I will refer to more broadly as, anti-urbanism or radical urbanism, is the disurbanists. And they go a little bit further. They basically say, we don't want any intersection, even one of them says, is a bit too far. We want to have linear cities. And there were actually some plans for this were kind of put into action in Stalingrad before the war, where they built these lines effectively of housing complexes and factories, and then there would be a line of a park and a railway line and a road, all in a line, all in these linear chunks next to the river or whatever natural feature prompted them to build there. And these sort of disurbanist goal for this linear city was essentially to see a bunch of those just crisscrossing the entire country or eventually the entire world. And that's not what happened, obviously, but they held a lot of sway. Both of these sort of radical urbanist tendencies held a lot of sway in the urban planning world in the 1920s, late 1920s. And that's why metro construction sort of became anathema. It wasn't something you could talk about in that Cultural Revolution period when all these radical ideas are being propounded of 1928 to 1931. I also want to say about that topic, I'm losing my train of thought here. Train. That's exactly what it is about methods of transit. Please keep that in, editor. That for these radical urbanists, they don't dislike trains. They have nothing against trains. Trains are a symbol of motion to them too, just like airplanes and blimps, dirigibles, and even portable houses in some of the more sort of fanciful versions, which are really cool. But what they're really hot on is the car. They really like the idea of giving every Soviet citizen a car. And nowadays, we know that would be catastrophic for environmental and reasons, and for just if you look at cities in terms of urban planning, when you design things around cars, they're atrocious for anybody who's not in a car. But at the time, this was seen as a way to maximize freedom. It was a way to say to automobilize the territory would be to give everyone their maximum freedom. And so we think of there's this debate of collectivism versus individualism within socialism and within the Soviet Union, and there's a debate about what was valued at what point, even within historical circles. And the 1928-31 period is very interesting because you see in literature a lot of collective metaphors, but in this anti-urbanist school, you see a lot of sort of emphasis on individual motion and liberty. I bring this all up in order to say this is part of why a metro is not really favored at this point. It's sort of looked on as enforcing urban agglomeration. Trains aren't a problem. Again, motion is very, very important. Like in the avant-garde tradition, there's this the famous poem by Vladimir Mayakovsky called The Flying Proletariat, uses the airplane as a metaphor for total freedom to move and do whatever you want and to defeat capitalists in dogfights as well, because we got to have fun somewhere. But an urban rail network that forces a city to congeal and stay in its historical form around a central point, that is not what the anti-urbanists want to see. And that is sort of the important context for what's going on in the leftist sphere at the time, and what really has ascendancy in that Cultural Revolution period. And it's in reaction to that a lot of and on its basis that a lot of the metro literature and the art of the metro itself and the narratives surrounding it are constructed.
We've got the ideology. We've got the idea that metros are constraining. Without trying to load this question too much, I mean, to what extent does Stalin's ultimate favour for the metro derive to some extent from the notion that he does actually believe this, that it is a helpful tool of totalitarianism?
Right. Yeah. How much was it like a way to get people to go where he wanted, and also to show them what he wanted, to control their experience of culture? I mean, that's true. It's not as though Stalin just wanted total artistic freedom in what eventually is built and the art that is executed on the metro. He did want a particular line that came to sort of be socialist realism. But it's not as simple as saying it's just bread and circuses, or it's just Stalin showing off to the West, or it's just, again, social control. There's a very real way in which these stations are supposed to create new people, not just force them into submission. They're supposed to, again, allow for that self-actualization. So it's kind of hard to describe this over audio, right, without images. But if you look up a couple of stations, you can get the idea. Yeah, they're kind of kitsch in the 1930s. They're not necessarily. You can object to them on grounds of, there's too much going on. But for the average person, they're supposed to be beautiful. They're supposed to be something you can look at and say to yourself, I'm experiencing culture. I'm experiencing, something that is going to give me taste. And that's really the key, is that at this point as well, as we're moving into the period of socialist realism, the point of socialist realism as a literary genre or style is it's supposed to be about the development of reality in its revolutionary development, to quote, I think, Andrei Zhdanov in a speech he made at the 1932 Writers' Congress or something like that. But the point is that he and Gorky, Maxim Gorky, who was sort of the godfather of this style, really wanted an artistic and literary genre that would show the important points of history and show people their role in history. It was didactic, but it was legitimately supposed to give people an understanding, not just in a sort of false way, that they were taking part in a project of world historical importance. And so the literature of this period is heavily focused on building things and on the construction of socialism and getting factories back into action. But it's not just dry and emotionless. It's about building people too. There's this concept that's very important in socialist realism of the new Soviet man, is what they generally translate it as. I mean, new Soviet person would be a little more respectful, I think. But you very often see new Soviet man. So if I slip and say that, I hope listeners will understand. The point is that this new Soviet person is supposed to be, like, in every way better and a cut above the Soviet or the non-Soviet person that they're replacing. They're supposed to be cultured. Kulturность is very important, and it's a very bourgeois notion of kulturность. As we move out of the first 5-year plan from 1928 to 1932, which was heavily focused on heavy industry, into the second 5-year plan from 1932 onwards, there's a shift in what the plan is focusing on producing from again, heavy industry to light industry, consumer goods, fine china, nice things to have around the house. And there's this developing notion that we're no longer really building the industrial basis of a new society. And that's why, again, these sort of mechanical metaphors that had been so much a part of the Cultural Revolutionary period start to fall out of use. And we move towards, again, focus on manners and being morally upright and learning to read. And, literacy is very important for this Cultural Revolution concept throughout all of its permutations, not just in that specific period. That's the new Soviet man, someone who's going to be cultured in the literal literary sense, but also manners, and someone who is a shining example of humanity, basically. And that is what the Metro is trying to do, in addition to solving the transit crisis and staking out a particular political line in terms of the future of the socialist city. It's trying to create the people who will inhabit that city and who will, by their culturation, make it into that kind of utopia that everyone was hoping for.
What is utopia here? What do they know?
What is utopia is really at the heart of all this again. So for the anti-urbanists, again, it was verdant and leafy and green. And for the people who were responsible for drawing up the first 5-year plan, it was industrialized. It was able to provide everything necessary for the country. But for the Metro in particular, the notion of utopia that they're working on is not just about people being, able to read. It's not just about leafy things. In a lot of ways, it's a society populated by heroes, kind of, is what happens. The transformation from the Cultural Revolution to socialist realism. We move from sort of everyone as a truly mature, self-actualized person to truly mature, self-actualized people who are also capable of heroic deeds in the service of the revolution. And there's a lot more focus on individual, again, attainment. And that comes in part, and that's why the metro is so interesting for this. It comes in large part out of the process of construction, that construction was so difficult for so long, especially 1931 into 1933, really. There's very little actually gets done in that period because they're dealing with atrocious soil conditions. They're dealing with very, very inadequate mechanization equipment and a lot of foreign equipment that nobody has really seen in the Soviet Union yet, and that is looked on with a bit of suspicion. Work in that period is really very difficult, even not to mention the terrible housing conditions which continue, especially for the migrant laborers who work on the metro. There's also the aspect that they're forced to work in airless tunnels deep underground after they switch tunneling methods, which is a whole other discussion about ideology. But these airless tunnels where the soil consistency, like it holds its consistency and then you dig it out and it turns into sour cream, is what one of the quotes I read said. It's terrible. And then over the process, over 1934 and into 1935, they learn the techniques that they need to deal with this kind of digging, but there's still a heavy emphasis on shock work and on heroic labor and on going above and beyond. And when everyone goes above and beyond, it's kind of, a little, you have to enforce it a little bit. And of course, there was a lot of coercion to get people to work on the metro. But there was a legitimate degree to which people just did this with genuine, perhaps not heroic intent, but with genuine, willingness to sacrifice. And that is what gets really picked up on in this idea of utopia that emerges out of the metro and into socialist realism, is the willingness to sacrifice and the willingness to put in superhuman effort. And that, again, is sort of where it interacts with anti-urbanism, that we move from man living in harmony with nature in these anti-urbanist settlements, where I think constructivist architect Moisei Ginsburg said at one point, all I want is for the workers to be able to listen to skylarks as they work in the height of the Cultural Revolution. We move from that to man's mastery over nature, that nature is something that is there to be exploited for the comfort and prosperity of this socialist utopia. And the metro and the difficulty of work on it, I think, is a place where that transformation really takes root.
We've talked a bit about, well, I say a bit, quite a bit, about the idea of kind of where construction and the idea of difficulty and of triumph play a part in Soviet ideology. I mean, is it just about the triumph over nature? Is there sort of a more internal idea of triumphing over either individualness or of sort of particular social constructions as well? Or
oh no, exactly. I mean, it's almost as though we talked about a couple of questions that might help me illustrate what I mean here, or something like that. But yes, it was seen as a way, again, to this development of the new Soviet person and of acculturation was seen in that same way as a victory over one's own self. And so it wasn't just about we're going to bend nature to our will. It's we have the power within ourselves to bend ourselves to become whatever we want. And again, that goes back to that concept of freedom of motion, freedom of self-actuation, with motion as the main metaphor for that. The metro was it was seen as an educative experience for people who built it, for turning them into cultured people, because now man, or people generally, is able in socialism to become whatever they want. And that's why I think, if you'll indulge me to go on a slight tangent that might lead us into another question, that's why I have a lot of actually willingness to believe in things that look otherwise like propaganda, things that you'll see so there are 2 collective literature volumes about the construction of the metro, where people were supposed to write down their experiences working on the metro, and then that would be collected and edited and published to show what construction was like, and give people a direct connection with the people who had built their metro. Those narratives, of course, were massaged, if not directly edited, by literary figures. But the point that I'm bringing up here is that I think there's a fair degree to which we can legitimately believe what people have to say in those narratives, even though they were massaged or outright edited by people with a little bit more of a stake in towing the party line. There's a very real urge here, I think, to write yourself into that forward progression of history, and to be seen as reaching the same heights of attainment, of becoming that new Soviet person and self-actualizing. People want to self-actualize. They want to have these experiences. And I think that's really, again, to go back to some of the historiographical debates surrounding this, that complicates a lot of these things that we think we understand about totalitarianism, or even beyond totalitarianism, if you go one step further and say, well, everyone was actually looking out for their own interests, and it was all about resistance, not about state control. It's not as simple as that second step either. There's a very complicated sort of negotiation and spectrum of who counts as actually being on the side of the state and who is exercising their own interests. And the metro, and especially this literary project surrounding it, are really interesting places where we can see that it doesn't fall easily into categories of oppressor and oppressed, or collaborator and dissident. Everyone is negotiating with themselves and with the state the degree to which they're comfortable writing themselves into history, basically. And the metro, again, is a place where we see that in action. We see a lot of people who had been anti-urbanists actually getting to work as editors, anti-urbanist sort of leaning literary figures, like a guy named Boris Pilniak in particular is who I'm thinking of here. He was an anti-urbanist, and then he worked as an editor on these tomes of metro collective literature. And that just shows that especially on the metro, but everywhere in Soviet society, it's never as simple as someone is a collaborator or someone is rebelling. There is, just like in our society, just like in any society, there may be a greater degree of the government may have a freer hand in trying to enforce its dictates. But in some ways, that almost reflects a weaker state. That almost reflects in a state lashing out and trying to exercise its power wherever it can, because it can't exercise softer forms of power. And it's just, the point is, this is all to say, the Moscow Metro shows us a very interesting lens into the nature of Soviet power and into the way that people interacted with it and built their lives around it.
To loop back to something you mentioned earlier, there's one thing that you brought up that I thought was quite interesting, was the idea of these literary volumes about the experience of actually building the thing. And the reason for that, of course, is that we tend to associate the Moscow Metro very much with purely visual art. And we don't tend to think of it also as, to some extent, how it features as a literary construction. I mean, I guess you covered that already, but that serves as my segue into, well, let's talk about the visual art. I mean,
totally.
What was displayed, and how much did it differ from station to station? Does it have some... Is it related to when stations were generally built, or were there sort of specific... Was the whole thing very much planned out in advance with certain stations assigned to particular artists?
Yeah, so definitely the Moscow Metro, there's a literary world of narratives surrounding it, but primarily it is supposed to be a visual experience. That's how, again, like I said, it's supposed to give people an entry into the world of culture, and into the world of socialist realist culture particularly. So the art of the metro, Yeah, it was. It does vary a lot based on when the stations were built. So some of the very earliest stations of 1935 actually do still look kind of avant-garde a little bit. There's a lot of they're moving into this classical style. It's not purely avant-garde like you would expect. So I'll throw out some names here if people want to look up images to enrich their understanding, because of course we are on a purely audio medium, sadly. But constructivist art of the avant-garde period, if you think of things like, so look up Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge is a famous constructivist painting. A lot of geometric shapes, dynamism of motion, simple colors, very legible, but also very abstract and not really about concrete events. It's more about revolution in the metaphorical sense and in the sense of creating a revolution in the art world. And there's still some of that going on in the early metro stations. There's a lot of clean lines. If you look at, throw out some station names. There's a station called Sokolniki, which was built in 1935. And there are a bunch of pillars running the length of the station. And there are tiled walls, and the pillars are made of blue marble and the walls are cream. And there's a white plaster ceiling, and it's all very rectilinear, which is actually... it's slightly classical, but it's very much like, if you look up, again, I mentioned Moisei Ginsburg. If you look up a building he designed called the Narkomfin building, Narkomfin, so on and so forth, you'll see that there's a lot of these rectilinear shapes. That's a big motif in constructivist art and architecture, and it carries on in the early metro. So you can also see that there are these cutouts in the ceiling of Sokolniki. If you look it up, they're coffered ceilings, it's what it's called. And those are moving into the direction of classicism. You can also see, especially on the tops of the pillars, they start to move away from just having them be pure shape into their cornices, is what it's called. There are like wheat motifs at the very top of these pillars in some of the 1935 stations. And that is going to become very, very big in the later stations. When I say later, I mean more towards the late 1930s and into the 1940s, into the true sort of socialist realist period of the metro. So the station where this really switches, I think, is you look at any station built in 1935. And again, actually, I'm not going to throw too many names out that will confuse listeners, but if they look up metro stations timeline on Wikipedia or something like that, I'm pretty sure there's a good list that shows when each station was built. Look at any 1935 station, you'll see these simple features, but moving in the direction of classicism. And then look up the station called Kievskaya, which on the light blue line, make sure you get that one, because otherwise you'll see this 50s very ornate Russian folk art version of socialist realism from the dark blue line. But it's on the light blue line. This is opened in 1937. And here is where I think the transition really happens. We move from, it's no longer just square columns. They're now 12-sided. It's still cream tiled walls, but there's a lot more detail. The tiles are much smaller. There are different shades. There's a lot more use of deep red and gold and cream with each other, not just one at a time. They start to intermesh, and that moves us really into the more ornate style of true socialist realism. You can also, again, if you look up Kievskaya and look at the tops of each pillar, we have that wheat motif, which was very simple and sort of stylized in what you think of as, again, avant-garde in the 1935 stations. It suddenly becomes much, much more realistic in Kievskaya, which was, I don't think I mentioned, opened in 1937, by the way. Suddenly the wheat sheaves are not just sort of these images of wheat sheaves that look like, they could be just a bunch of arrows and indicating dynamism like you would expect in avant-garde art. Now they're literally sheaves of wheat that are molded into the porcelain of these cornices at the top of the columns. And so we start to see, as metro construction progresses, there are stages of it. There's a move from more avant-garde influenced stuff to more socialist realist, sort of accessible and definitely more conventionally and historically beautiful kinds of art. And if you don't mind me actually continuing on with this a little bit, so one thing to mention as well is that all of these stations were designed by different architects and then executed by various different sculptors. So this station, Kievskaya, actually those cornices won a prize, and they were praised by a critic in one publication or other. I can't remember exactly what we're talking about here, but yeah, sorry, I looked it up really quickly. It's the critic was Boris Alexeyev, and this was, he looked at this, which was designed by an architect named Chichulin, and it was executed by a sculptor named Danko. And Alexeyev thought that this was one of the most important steps, quote, of Soviet art on the path to socialist realism, and its battle against oversimplification, quote. So that shows you that there's an explicit and intentional move away from that sort of more constructivist thing to a less radical view of what beautiful, great art should be.
But we've been talking a little bit about this sort of transition to classicism, and anyone who's sort of read the bios that I put up about myself occasionally will know that I've always had kind of a toe in that puddle for a while. I mean, why does classicism come back? What does it mean for the architects and sculptors of the Moscow Metro? And why does it come back, given supposedly the idea that the Soviet Union is a new society that is putting away all the worst parts of the past?
Exactly. That's a great question, honestly. So basically, yes, they are building a new society that is supposed to no longer be reliant on outdated forms of political organization. But the Soviet Union is very heavily influenced by ideas of, in the same way that the early United States was, ideas of political participation that may not necessarily originally actually come from Greece and Rome, but were believed to descend through this supposed European culture from Greece and Rome. So people will often look at this sort of Greco-Roman trend in the metro in the 30s and 40s and say, yes, so that's Stalin saying we're a great empire, just like Greece and Rome. We are powerful. We are, a force to be reckoned with, perhaps even militarily. And that's, again, it's not entirely wrong, this idea of showing off great power and saying we're an empire like that. But it's a lot more nuanced. And what I think the best way to understand it is really to see it, again, as an expression of a belief in A, active citizenship, and B, culture, again, but then also C, cultural leadership, especially. So to go back to A, to go to active citizenship, there's this. There are a lot of again bas-reliefs in stations, like Dinamo is one. Dynamo basically is the translation. It is. It's the station right near the big soccer stadium in Moscow, and there are bas-reliefs of people engaged in athletic activity. Doing gymnastics. There are, all throughout the station, there are these sort of Greco-Roman touches of wreaths, and it's very bright and white in the way that we think of that Greek Renaissance style. The reason that we see these expressions of, again, motion and dynamism, and so drawing on cultural revolutionary ideas in that sense, but the reason why we now see them in athletic form is because there was this association in or at least Soviet writers believed that there had been an association in ancient Greece between athletic participation and political participation. That if you we now, of course, will always point out that not everybody was afforded political participation in supposed Greek democracy, which is a very valid point to make. But for the Soviets, what mattered is that people were allowed to participate in running their political sphere of their polity, and they were also allowed to participate athletically. And that, again, points to this idea of self-actualization, that people would be given the opportunity to be active in every possible sense of the word and to control their lives in every possible sense of the word. And that extended to athletic activity and a veneration of Greco-Roman art that portrayed athletic activity as well. But the point of this is all to say that that's what they're drawing on. They're saying, we, like the Greeks, value athletic activity, and we value giving everyone a chance to participate in their society. Maybe it's not like democracy the way we understand it here in the United States, or in whatever other country one might be located in while recording this, perhaps. I'm the only one of us who is in the United States right now. But it is still a notion, if not of democratic republicanism, then of a kind of political participation and activity in democracy. And then the other thing I mentioned that I wanted to say, in addition to simply having an appreciation of culture, is the idea of cultural leadership. So these Greco-Roman motifs are also a way for the Soviet leadership to say, we are a cultural center. Yes, we're kind of cut off from the rest of the world in some senses. Politically, they're opposed to us. But there were still many instances where cultural figures were allowed to travel to the Soviet Union, and often they were, given a guided tours and a rather rosy picture of what was happening, and the true, atrocities were hidden from them. But there was a fair degree of cultural interchange still, a great degree even. And that is what the avant-garde had prided itself on back in the day, in the 1920s, and even earlier in the sort of Petersburg heyday of the avant-garde before the revolution. And now, even though that kind of avant-garde radicalism, the kinds of art that it was associated with are no longer seen as the right way to achieve socialism. Socialist art must now be comprehensible to the average person and show them their role in history instead of being so abstract, and so on and so forth. There is still a belief that we, as the leaders of history, as the people pushing history forward, we will also push culture forward. We will be a cultural center. And that Greco-Roman trend is how socialist leadership says, in addition, no, we're still culturally important. We still are a center in the way that Greece and Rome was, and people look up to us.
I'm going to note that there's sort of a thing hanging over the backdrop of all of this, which is that athleticism isn't just athleticism. To some extent, at least historically, it's also associated with militarism, which the Soviet Union, I think, is much more associated with than its artistic movements. And obviously, I don't want to harp too much on that aspect, but presumably that does also come through to some extent, both in the metro itself and also in other aspects of transport. As you noted earlier, the example of, flight is great because it increases mobility and also lets us shoot down capitalists.
Yeah, exactly. Flight is a huge motif. It was a huge motif in avant-garde art, like I said, representing freedom. And it still represents freedom in the socialist realist version of that. But it does have some military connotations, to be sure. To take an example, so Mayakovskaya, named again after the man, Vladimir Mayakovsky, who wrote that poem about the flying proletariat, about shooting down capitalists in dogfights. It is a station that is very heavily associated with flight and upwards motion, again, moving away and out from under the ground. As I said, there was this anti-urbanist objection was partly grounded in the desire to move towards brightness and away from these dark, ugly tunnels that one had associated with capitalism. What basically Mayakovskaya is doing then is saying, we can still put you in a space that is mentally located above the clouds while you are underground. And again, that draws on this idea of overcoming nature. We can do anything we want. We can create any space we want through willpower. But the point is, how does Mayakovskaya do this? What does it do to with its motifs of flight? And so basically there are some interesting things, like it's much more open than any previous station. The columns are much they're narrower. It used some fancy engineering stuff to achieve that, which, oh boy, I could spend an hour talking about, all that. But what matters for our purposes is that the columns, the cladding on each corner of these columns, if you look up Mayakovskaya, you will see it's very beautiful, very open, but the columns are clad in steel on the corners. And that was steel from an airplane production factory. So there's a literal connection there. And also in the ceiling of the station, there is a series of mosaics called 24 Hours in the Land of the Soviets, which show images of people engaging in athletic pursuits, playing volleyball, for example, parachutists jumping out of Soviet bombers, fighter planes, but also more peaceful topics. So smokestacks of factories, trees, fruit, birds. But all of these things, regardless of what they are, each of these mosaics is seen at an odd angle. First of all, you have to stop right in the middle of the hall and crane your neck upwards, and that disorients you. And then all of the mosaics are executed in each of these 24 hours in the land of the Soviets things in the ceiling. They're executed in such a way that it looks like when people are playing volleyball, you don't just see them, like it's not a Top Gun shot where you see the scene and the beach and everybody's location is very obvious. It's not an establishing shot. I don't know why I went with Top Gun there. The point is, you see the people from below. You see them from odd angles. You see the sky behind them, no matter what is happening. You see the sky behind the birds, behind the smokestacks, behind the fruit and the leaves. And that, again, disorients you. And it puts you in that space of being in flight and being out of the material world with these people who have transcended. They have achieved the immortality of being, immortalized in art, and you get a glimpse of that by watching it. To go back to the military thing really quickly, I did want to say, yes, so bombers, obviously, that's parachutists, fighter planes, that's militaristic. But there's also a great degree to which aviation, generally speaking, and the technical achievements of aviation, even if they're packaged in the form of a bomber or in the form of a fighter plane, are looked at in the Soviet Union as the encapsulation of everything that the Soviet Union is achieving. Again, because it's technology working to improve people's lives and give them not just, as we would see in the 1928 to 32 period, not just machines allowing people to achieve transcendence. We're now seeing the people in flight themselves almost like achieving transcendence just through sheer force of will. But to go back to the machines really quickly, Oso Aviachim was the official aviation club of the Soviet Union at this point. It was the largest single non-state organization in the country. Over 3 million people were in it. It was larger than the party. It was nearly as large as Moscow, if that puts things in context. Aviation is a big freaking deal in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. The perhaps national hero of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, other than perhaps Stakhanov, the coal miner who was famous for his great output, was Valery Chkalov, who was the first man to fly across the North Pole. I forget, whatever. The point is he was memorialized as such in the Soviet Union. Aviation, according to John McCannon, who wrote a book that I used on this about the role of the polar north and exploration in Soviet rhetoric, aviation was the cultural symbol of the USSR, in addition to perhaps Stalin and the Red Star. And so all of this stuff comes together on the ceiling of Mayakovskaya. There are these motifs of speed exploration, pushing boundaries, new possibility, transcendence, going above the realm of the mundane on the earth and ascending into the sky. And that is really what aviation means. It's about not just we can defeat you if we have to. It's about transcendence and joy and again, utopia.
I want to segue a bit, just to give us something to cap it off, because we are coming up for time. One thing that struck me as you talked about building, the murals at Mayakovskaya, which I had a quick look at online just to help myself visualize it.
Yeah, I really do suggest if you have the opportunity, go and look up some Moscow metro stations from the 1930s, because I don't want to give myself a cop-out here, but it's very hard to see this, and it's hard to describe it through an audio medium.
You mentioned that the angles at which we look at people are a little odd. And I'm wondering, is to what extent is this sort of slight remove an intentional feature of the Moscow Metro? Is it trying deliberately to sort of create a slight remove from the idealistic pictures that you're seeing and the people actually taking it? To what extent is it actually about, on the other hand, actually trying to create these connections? This isn't just a far-off ideal. You are this person.
Yeah, exactly. So it's about creating remove, in the sense of these larger-than-life types that you see on the ceiling of Mayakovskaya engaging in sports or whatever. But it is also about trying to say, this can be you, and about trying to create a sense of community. So to set the stage for this very briefly, basically, there's this very big concern in Russian intellectual thought in the 19th century that people are terrified of this concept of poshlost. And I give you the Russian word there because it's kind of hard to translate. But basically, it's kind of like if you can imagine banality and mundanity and everyday life and vulgarity all wrapped up into one thing that is the worst thing you can possibly imagine. It is the failure to imagine the internality of another person. It's when you're going about your day and you're running on a script. It's everyday, like mundanity, again, everyday life. You're just going about your business, interacting with people, but not really seeing them. Dostoevsky despises this about the West. It's his big complaint. Gogol is his great novel, Dead Souls, is about that fear of not really being a fully actualized person and of not really seeing other people as fully actualized people. But the point is, this is a long tradition in Russian literature and intellectual thought. And where the Metro interacts with that is that these collective literature volumes, again, were supposed to give the readers of them an unmediated understanding of the people who worked on the Metro. And you say, oh, well, they just wrote a book. You know, every book is like that. But the specific way that these narratives are formulated, and I think, again, massaged a little bit by literary editors, shows you that this was really the intent. And you can see this so to start off actually really quickly with the art of the Metro itself. Yes, there's it's supposed to disassociate you from these perfect types, but it's supposed to show you what you could achieve in these communal scenes that are also throughout the Metro. But now that was just to try and hopefully tie things back together. What really the meat of it, again, is in the literature. In the introduction to one of these collective literature works, I believe it's called Stories of the Metro Builders is the one of the two that I'm thinking of here. The quote goes, names of our workers and builders, and I translated this and it's not exact, are passed from lips to lips. Their feats are sung by poets. Their lives inspire the games and dreams of our children. We compose songs about them. It's like, again, it's this workers' paradise where your famous people are not dilettantes and actors. It's people who are doing something meaningful, whatever your definition of that may be in this case, for society. But it's also, again, it's about immediate connection. It's about knowing someone's name. It's about passing their reputation on, and in a very direct sense. Once you get out of the introduction, there's a lot of discussion of how the metro is kind of, as an object, it's dead. But we are writing this project, and we did the art that we did on the metro specifically to try and overcome that gap, the death that this is just a dead object. We tried to overcome that and attain a live connection. So in that literature, again, there are all these mentions of people becoming new Soviet workers, not just because they work on the metro and they go, wow, socialism's cool, I want to learn to read. No, it's because they are working as a community, and because they see their fellow socialist person working alongside them, and they decide, I want to be better, not than the person working next to me, but with them. I want to become a community. I want to grow as a group. There are two other particular instances where I saw this that I think illustrate it very well, and one is actually kind of funny. One of the writers of these narratives, he begins his narrative by saying, there are many wonderful constructions on the metro, but the most wonderful and miraculous construction is the collective of workers, engineers, and technicians of Mitrostroy. Mitrostroy is the construction agency that actually built the metro. And the point is just that it's like he basically just came out and said the real metro was the friends we made along the way. And I mean, it's kind of hokey, but I think it's nice. And it's funny, and yet it's also very heartfelt. And so again, that's about not just creating individual new Soviet people, but about creating a new community, about the transformation of a community into its ideal self. And then the other example that I wanted to give is that this is what really made me see this. There's one of the narratives is about the guy working on the metro who's writing it is saying, we did all this work, and then we would come up at the end of our shift and talk to people living on the surface, and I think like construction workers in some building being built. He doesn't specify. And they just sort of, they would joke with us. They would when it's completed, then they would say, can we see this station? And again, it happens to be Sokolniki, the station that he was working on that I mentioned earlier. So if you want to see literally what is supposed to produce this reaction, you can go back and look it up. And at first, these people who had been working on the surface who say, hey guys, can we see what you've been working on? They enter the vestibule on the surface, the sort of entry hall, and they make, quote, familiar jokes and snide remarks. And it's like, oh, well, you've been putting in a lot of work on this, I can see, that kind of thing. And then they get onto the escalator and they descend. And at the same time, of course, if I were being all literary, I might say they ascend too, of course. But they then, what the guy writing this narrative describes is, he says, they become totally silent and they really look at the architecture and the art and they really take it all in. And we hear them, quote, we hear their oohs and ahs. Oh, and they say things like, you've built a real marvel here, comrades. And then he finishes this chapter with these surface laborers leaving the station, having seen what these people they've been joking with have been working on this whole time. And he ends it with the sentences, I felt now an entirely different intonation in how they addressed us. They shook our hands firmly as they left. And that's, again, it's not literally they looked us in the eyes and we saw that they understood us as people, but that's the intent, is to say, we went from just, we're having a joke and these are guys that we respect them because of their profession, but they're just interchangeable people, to they've seen what we've poured our heart and soul into. And now they understand us. They can look us in the eye and they don't follow a script anymore. This is no longer banal everyday life to them. we've transcended past that. I don't think I mentioned this, but really quickly, one other thing that Mayakovsky was writing about in The Flying Proletariat with Flight was the transcendence of everyday reality. And, you get home and there's things all over the floor and you got to clean up your apartment and whatever. Transcending that into novy byt is the term in Russian, which means like a new existence, the new existence where everything matters again towards the ultimate progression of history. And this example here in the Metro literature basically is, in my view, what it's saying is this is our way of attaining novy byt, and it's through a new existence. It's through people coming in and seeing just how much effort and how much love we poured into the Metro, and then they understand not just wow, this is an impressive physical object, but they look at it and they see that someone cared, and someone cared so much about building socialism and attaining their perfect self in the end of history. And so basically that's the example I wanted to give, but to sort of cap it all off, basically that is really why the Metro, I think, it's why it's mythologized the way it is, and it shows us something very interesting about socialist realism. Again, it tells us that socialist realism, for all it's criticized for being, unoriginal and workaday and just sort of basic plots and not very inspired and lacking interiority or whatever, that may be the case. A lot of socialist realist literature isn't great. But at the same time, there's a very real urge behind it, a real desire to say, to connect with one's fellow man and to attain a real understanding. And even if the art itself is a little trite in the name of accessibility, of course, there's a real heart and soul behind it. I'm saying that about stations built in 1935, 37, 38. That's right in the middle of the Great Terror. And that is the moment when, we have all these trite, banal recitations of guilt that are completely false. And that failure to imagine the other human as a real person with an interiority, with a self, with a soul, that reaches new heights or depths, you could say, in the Great Terror of, 37, 38. And that irony, that contradiction, I don't really know what to say about it. I think that is really the great mystery and appeal of studying this period and location in history for me, is that the terror was it was built on a reification of a concept, of an idea of progress, of a new Soviet person, and of a utopia, even as it was completely destroying the foundations of compassion and understanding that those progress and utopia and the new Soviet person were rhetorically supposed to be built on. And people did things we can never understand to other people in the name of understanding people. And that contradiction is just wild to me and fascinating. And the Moscow Metro is just one example, but it's a very important example in the development of this contradiction of utter inhumanity and utter, love for humanity that I don't know how to reconcile it, and that's why I want to study this.
I think that's a nice note to end on then. So thank you for coming on.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It's been difficult to try and marshal my thoughts again, but I really appreciate the opportunity.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.